So welcome back. So in part one, I was talking about the kind of evolutionary origins of some of our kind of major emotional states and what we know about how they come into being on a physiological level. So in this second part, what I'd like to do is look at what has been called emotional intelligence, i.e. the ability to recognize the kind of emotional state that we're in, to be able to perhaps label it where it's appropriate, and also starting to understand how our emotions affect our well-being and that of others, and how we might use that knowledge to help us manage emotions and to make use of them intelligently and usefully. So not necessarily squashing emotions, but trying to understand how we integrate mind and body in a way that brings greater awareness and hopefully kind of solutions within our lives and the lives of others that are congruent with emotional states, but also make sense, and allow us to continue to follow our plans and to be fair and just and things like that. So Goleman, who came up with this term originally, defined this as the ability, capacity, skill, or self-perceived ability to identify, assess and manage the emotions of oneself, of others and of groups. And so we'll be looking mostly at his definition of emotional intelligence and what the implications of that are for our well-being. So if you remember back to the emotions lecture or the positive psychology lecture in your first semester in the Introduction to Applied Psychology module, you'll remember that you were presented with lots of different models for how we understand emotion from a psychological perspective. And if you like, the kind of the most advanced form of explanation is one which, so if you take this diagram here, shows firstly that, if you follow this from left to right, that we're greeted with a stimulus. Let's say that is something fearful on this occasion. This kicks off an autonomic nervous response. In this case, we're going to say it's a sympathetic nervous response. Okay, so heart racing, sweating, etc. All of the things we talked about in the first lecture. And according to Schechter and Singer's two-factor theory, the two factors are, one is the autonomic response, okay, and the other is cognition. That these are two parallel processes. And if you remember, in their experiment, what they did was they injected participants with adrenaline, so a known physiological response, and then they manipulated the situation to see whether they could change how the participants interpreted those emotions. And they used an actor to do that. So in different situations, one the actor would be entertaining, very jolly, very cheerful, and in the other, the actor would be aggressive, confrontational, etc. And what they found was that the participants would interpret their own emotions in quite different ways. So being euphoric for the happy stooge, and being angry for the aggressive stooge, okay, aggressive actor. And then they also found that if they injected people with adrenaline and they gave them no kind of prompt, that they were quite able to recognize that this was what they called cold arousal, i.e. there was no emotional element to it whatsoever. So if you like, this is exactly where emotional intelligence resides. Okay, so if you look in the middle of this cross, where we've got euphoria, anger, cold arousal, fear, is this process of figuring out how we should respond in a given situation. Okay, so if we move this from an experimental situation, we are learning this from the moment we're born, how to interpret the emotions that we should be feeling and how we should use them to deal with that situation. And also that same process has been called appraisal. Okay, so that decision-making process of how we cope with a stressful situation and whether we feel up to coping has also been called appraisal. And appraisal is a form of emotional intelligence. Okay, so this is, in a sense, this is something that you're familiar with from previous lectures. So this is a essential skill for human beings. How do we know what the feelings are that we have and the emotions that we feel? What do they mean in a given situation? Are we able to make sense or respond to those emotions in a way that maintains our effectiveness in a given situation? And does it inform how we live our lives rather than it just being this element that seems uncontrollable? Okay, do we know when it's appropriate to allow our emotions and take the lead from our feelings rather than just always taking a rational approach? How do we marry those two things together? So for Goleman, emotional intelligence is an essential element of being a kind of sound human being. Okay, for those who are effective in their lives, have also managed to harness that emotional element, okay, to foster the feelings that they have in a way that allows them to maintain control and also to kind of relate to other people. There's a lovely quote here from the book. People with well-developed emotional skills are also more likely to be content and effective in their lives, mastering the habits of mind that foster their own productivity. People who cannot marshal some control over their emotional life fight inner battles that sabotage their ability for focused work and clear thought. So this idea that for a long time in psychology, emotion has been seen as something that, if you like, undermines the kind of rational approach to understanding human beings. We're now beginning to realise that it's as McGilchrist puts it, it's inseparable from the way in which we think. Okay, it's just another perspective on how we understand the world, and it's something that we are constantly attending to or making sense of, even though we might not always be conscious of that process. So Goleman comes up with these 5 features of emotional intelligence, or what he calls EQ as opposed to IQ. Okay, so I'm going to go through each of these and just sort of outline what he's talking about in relation to each one. So starting with self-awareness. So I've sort of mentioned some of this already. This is about recognizing when one's in a particular emotional state, and also the impact that emotional state or expression might be having on other people. Is this something that we are able to do? And and I would say these are things that we're constantly learning. I don't think there's a point in one's life where one feels like one has encountered all forms of emotion and situations and you're completely okay with it. This is something that is ongoing. Okay, so can we kind of give a name to the emotions we're feeling? That's not always a necessary way to make sense of situations, but can we do that? And do we know what's causing them? So if we go back to Shachter and Singer's experiment, you know, could we, in that same situation, could we say what it is that's influencing our emotions and the way that we feel? And then I think there's also something about feeling in control, competence in relation to the emotions one feels, a sureness about one's self-worth and capabilities that comes into self-awareness. Now, self-regulation, I guess, is a more tricky scenario. Are we able to control our own emotions? Are we able to kind of do we know when our emotional response in a particular situation is appropriate or it's over the top? Okay, are we able to then control those emotional reactions? Is that something that we're able to do if we need to? Okay, there may be occasions where it is appropriate to fully express one's emotions. So knowing when to regulate in that sense is really important. Reframing stress reactions, so situations where we feel overly anxious, are we able to reconcile our reaction, our emotional reaction, and to maintain some kind of control over that using whatever methods we use? And I guess when we get stuck in moods, okay, are we able to shift those moods? Are we able to get ourselves out of the doldrums? So these are all skills that we learn, hopefully, to our lives. And of course, this relates to achieving things in our lives as well. Are we able to kind of marry up the things we want to achieve versus the emotions we feel in relation to those achievements? So, and anger is another really interesting one for this. So there are, of course, times when anger is really appropriate and really important in order to get across a situation where we feel oppressed in some way or wronged in some way. It's always really important to defend oneself in that way. But as you see with this picture here, you know, occasions of road rage or rage generally, is it always possible to maintain that control and make sure that you don't completely throw the baby out with the bathwater? And Gowan also identifies one of these really important elements of self-regulation, which is to do with self-control. The ability to control one's impulses is probably at the core of self-regulation. Okay, so when, you know, we might have a kind of immediate reaction to a situation, which is that an impulsive reaction where we want to act, we want to express something. How able are we to control that? So in the 1970s, end of the 1960s, early 1970s, there was a lovely experiment where they looked at kids' ability to sit in a room, and they were told if they didn't take the marshmallow, they would get another one in 5-10 minutes. Okay, and they looked at which kids were able to control themselves in that way. Okay, so they were left in the room on their own with this one marshmallow, not this pile here, but one marshmallow. Could they resist it? And what they did was they came back to those same kids in 1990, okay, when they were, well, they must have been in their early 20s by then, okay, and they looked at what had gone on for them, and they found that those kids that were most able to control themselves had better academic competence and performance, SAT scores. Apparently they were better able to put their ideas into words, to respond to reason, and they had a better ability to concentrate on what it was they would, you know, their particular goals. So these long-standing effects of what seems like a kind of a sort of, in some senses, a trivial element of self-control, but as you can see, this is a trait that plays out in one's life in greater ways. So self-motivation, the ability to, despite how one's feeling emotionally, to continue to pursue one's aims and one's goals. This is a skill that we learn, of course. Are we willing to put ourselves through adversity to achieve great things? And that is a real skill. So, and a lot of this is emotional stuff. There'll be an inner reluctance or a lack of inspiration or energy in some ways. And have we developed techniques for dealing with that and maintaining our kind of focus on goals in our lives? And of course, when one is performing, again, this can also interrupt. And this is a kind of mixture, I guess, of self-regulation and self-motivation. Is one able to manage anxiety or stress in the right way in order to achieve one's best? Okay, and that doesn't, as we saw in the first part of this lecture, this isn't necessarily about having no stress. It's about having the right amount of stress. Okay. So we come to empathy, which of course, is a central social skill, if you like. But it's closely related to the ability to understand one's own emotions and to be able to see that other people may have the same emotional states, to acknowledge that same inner process of dealing with one's emotions, trying to understand and fathom what's going on in an emotional sense, is also what is going on for someone else. Okay, without that sort of inner inquiry into the meaning of one's emotions, then it's very difficult to see how one could achieve harmony in social relationships. So acknowledging that is part of other people's experience, and also the value of sharing what is actually going on for one, is really important, because it's about acknowledging that this is part of the human condition, and the kind of search for understanding one's own emotions and how they impact on other people is kind of part of that. And also, I guess, there's this differentiating one's emotions from others. So at the same time as one might be able to empathize with someone else, there are times when one can see that somebody else is suffering or experiencing a certain emotion, but one doesn't feel that oneself. And being able to distinguish when emotional contagion, if you like, is appropriate or not, is another part of this skill in relation to empathy. And of course, this feeds into broader social skills. So learning how to get the best out of other people, understanding other people's skills, and perhaps in an emotional sense, how much they can cope with, what kinds of things might be difficult for them. And at the same time, you've got other, in relation to how you resolve conflicts with other people. So it's not just about individuals, when you're dealing with more than one other person, you're dealing with a group, and there's a whole other emotional level that comes into that. Okay. And then finally, recognizing how others work together. So recognizing that emotional intelligence isn't necessarily going to be the same for other people. When you combine people, you get them to work together, something else comes out of that combination. And learning how that plays out in life is another important element. And just finally, coming back to well-being, we know that not only do people with high emotional intelligence achieve better, there's also, on a kind of psychological level, there are these other things going on. So people with high emotional intelligence tend to have less depression, they're more optimistic, greater life satisfaction, and they tend to be happier on the whole and to think well of themselves. So there are these other kind of internal knock-on effects that are worth remembering. Okay, that's all for this part on emotional intelligence. I know this is a very short lecture, and there's quite a lot in this. So what I'm going to do is try and find some other videos for you to follow up on. So look in the links below this lecture for more info if you're interested. Okay, that's all for now. Bye.